Dylan let out a long, tired sigh, stuffing the 60-second folder today into his desk drawers. Still deep in thought, he drew out another from the chaotic pile strewn across his cold teak desk and started examining its contents. His ears stood erect in concentration, his tail wagging side to side slowly, making soft brushing sounds against the wood of his chair. Gritting his blunt teeth, he laid down the file and gave up trying to review its details. He simply couldn't concentrate any longer. "It's been so long, man, so long," he yawned out. "Surely there's something better to do around here. Surely some recruit to train or something. Where the hell are they when you actually need one for once?" The white-furred wolf adjusted and pawed the badge in his uniform. Claw Force Leading Agent, Delta. Dylan worked for a Special Operations Association, though, as the name would imply, without any special operation, there really wasn't much to do out in the field for Dylan. In the end, he decided to occupy his free time with a desk job of sorting and checking files. Dull streaks of light filtered through the thin windows from the cloudy day outside, casting soft stripes at the edge of Dylan's desk. He laid his head in his paws and let his thoughts drift to daydreams. Dylan missed being out in the front line. A longing for action and adventure nagged at his shirt. He yearned to see other furries again, to fulfill his job as being one of the few agents to train up and assess new recruits. For now, however, he was stuck in this room far too big to feel comforted by any warm feeling. About the size of a small cafe, the only thing that greeted Dylan in his office was the bitter cold of mornings and the lingering deathly silence. Fast-paced, thundering footsteps echoed outside the stairwell outside Dylan's office. Dylan snapped out of his daydream, twitching his ears a little. "Good luck to whoever has to deal with that frantic mess," he snickered to himself. Flicking through the file he was holding, Dylan was completely caught off guard by the deafening rap that pounded against his door mere seconds later. Tense in shock and fur standing on end, Dylan uttered no reply, letting whoever was outside read the larger "Do Not Disrupt" sign placed on the bland door. He swiveled his chair to face away from the door, and focused back on the information clasped tightly in his soft fur-laden paws. The locked handle jiggled. Dylan read on, giving it no attention. Without warning, a massive crash exploded from behind Dylan as someone burst through the door. Fully startled, Dylan nearly threw his file and its contents and spun around, braced in position and ready to fight off an attacker. What greeted him, however, wasn't a dingo ready to assassinate him, but rather a small folf, in basic terms, a fox-wolf hybrid. Brandishing a letter in the air and panting, he looked quite similar to Dylan in appearance and size, with an identical white fur coat and a few patches of color in places. Eyes darting to his mint-green hair and gold-crested cheek fluff, Dylan instantly recognized the folf as one of his own recruits in training, Critical. Dylan glared past Critical, still reeling over and panting, and at the door which stood flung open behind him. A heavy paw mark could be seen engraved into a chunk of wood which was now hanging off the door by its fibers. Another splintered fragment laid on the floor in front of the folf. Dylan barked at Critical, violently stammering from shock and anger. "Private C, are you out of your mind?" He paused as Critical scampered over to his desk and realized how desperate the folf was in getting to him. Without another word, Critical slammed the letter he was holding down on one of the only clear spaces on the wolf's cluttered desk. "Read it!" he gasped out, shortly before collapsing from exhaustion in front of the desk. Picking up the white sealed envelope, Dylan creased his eyebrows in concern for his recruit who had just rammed down the door and fallen to the tiles. "Private C, is everything alright?" Critical raised a feeble thumbs up above the desk. Reassured, Dylan sliced open the top of the letter and pulled out a sheet of paper with an authentic signature on the bottom from the leader of Claw Force herself. His eyes grew wide. Putting on a rustic pair of trapezium lens glasses, Dylan held the paper slip close to his face, almost wrapping it around his muzzle, reading eagerly. Still laying on the floor, Critical could hear Dylan through his perked-up ears. His breathing quickened, and he started muttering to himself. Remote island? Confidential operation? Today? Critical raised his ruffled head above the table just in time to see Dylan lower the paper and reveal the absolute shock and awe on his face. "They want me to what?" he exclaimed out. "They want you to go on an operation, Agent Delta," Critical answered. "To retrieve an ancient stone or something, I was told." Dylan tried his best to hold in his excitement, eager to throw his paws in the air and howl in joy. Yeah, well, it's a lot more than just that. It's some amulet of ancient origin. Standing up from his seat, he started frantically sweeping some of the objects right off his desk and stuffing them back in their filing cabinets. Oh my, you probably don't realize how important this is. Critical raised his eyebrows. It's the next piece in the puzzle. They finally found it, Dylan continued. By any chance, is this that ancient deer civilization thingy that the others are working to uncover? Yes, Dylan exclaimed, the fluffy blue tips of his ears active and erect in joy, his soft tail wagging vigorously. Critical had never seen his instructor so excited before. Agent Delta, when are you departing? Now! Having swept his cluttered desk clean, Dylan ran past Critical. Well, I hope you and your partner stay safe, Critical called out cheerfully as Dylan streaked past. Dylan's ears caught onto this. Eyes widened, he skidded to a halt with his hind legs and simply froze. A sudden realization had dawned on him, and all the excitement fell from his eyes. He didn't have a partner. It had only been 3 days, just 3 days ago, when news had broken out that his long-trusted former partner had left the force. Dylan was shattered by the loss, and having just recovered from his grief, it hurt a little to be reminded of him. Dylan paused on the spot, fixated with a synthesis of subtle despair and angst. He just didn't know what to do next. He knew he couldn't go alone, yet he didn't dare turn down the offer to finally be free. Agent Delta, is everything okay? Cocking his head a little, Critical stood watching Dylan, wondering why he had stopped and fallen so silent. His instructor replied with a soft sigh. Yeah, I'm fine. Turning around, Dylan laid a soft, gentle paw on Critical's shoulder and spoke, tone deep, sincere, and almost desperate in a way. Private C? Yes, Agent Delta? Looking up, Critical's light green eyes met Dylan's. I want you to come with me. Me? What about your partner, sir? Small tears formed around Dylan's eyes. Thankfully, Critical didn't take notice of them, despite the fact that their gazes were locked. He's not with us anymore, but we can look to the silver lining of this situation. I think you're ready to become an agent, and, well, I suppose letting you out in the field is a much better test than your final assessment. We might skip it completely. What do you think, Private C? Critical's face seemed to spring into as much excitement as Dylan's a few moments ago. Of course I would! Seeing the happiness on his recruit's face, Dylan smiled back, though, at the back of his mind, Dylan was very reluctant about taking a new recruit on the journey with him. Not only was he concerned about what Critical might do, but he was also worried about the safety of the folf. He stifled his angst and focused back to his recruit. Good, now come on, we have a taxi to catch, he replied back at Critical, grinning and giggling. Dylan bolted down the stairs and out the doors of the inconspicuous claw office block, Critical following close behind. Although the sky was completely overcast, the sudden contrast of light flashed Dylan's eyes, causing him to squint a little. Seeing a sleek silver taxi waiting by the pavement, Dylan ran for the curb and skidded to a halt, tail barely maintaining his balance. The tinted window winded down with an awkward screech. Agent Delta? A soft male voice questioned. That's me, Dylan replied. With a quick gesture from the driver, Dylan climbed in and Critical sat in the back. Without another word, the driver drove off. What an adventure this was going to be. After a long taxi drive of rolling countrysides and Critical pressing his nose to the window and panting from excitement, the two had finally arrived where they needed to be. Critical stepped out on the gravel road and took a curious look around. With Dylan stepping out too, the taxi departed. A beautiful open field lay before the pair. Dylan inhaled a long breath of the fresh air he longed for. It was beautiful. A gentle breeze filled the air, gently caressing and rippling the avid fur of the two adventurers. You definitely don't get out much, do you? Critical rhetorically inquired. Dylan exhaled. I've been stuck at that desk for 7 months. It's really a lot to miss, isn't it? Critical nodded in reply, still studying the surroundings. Around them was simply a dry open field, pristine in condition, devoid of the alteration of furry civilizations. All except... wait a second. Critical squinted through the tall ribbons of the yellow grass and saw the glint of metal. 4 shining pieces of metal. They were helicopter rotors. Critical looked over to Dylan, who was still taking in the environment and was oblivious to the small aircraft. He gave Dylan's tail a little nudge of his own. "Agent Delta?" Dylan snapped back into awareness and gave his attention to his recruit, who pointed at the hidden copter. Dylan raised his eyebrows in interest and gestured for Critical to follow. Together, they jumped the barbed wire fence and treaded swiftly through the waist-high herbage. Critical arrived first at the helicopter and was greeted by a sleek, tall, and friendly-seeming cheetah. She wore a neat and tidy uniform which conformed well with her gentle beige fur. On her head, she wore a fancy-looking headset with communication, ear protection, and whatever else you could think of. In other words, she looked ready to fly. The attractive cheetah looked at Critical enthusiastically and grinned, excited to be finally able to see him. "Private C, it's so nice to meet you," she rejoiced while giving the folf a gentle head pat. Critical purred gently and happily, feeling a soft warm paw in comfort from the cold breeze. Still caressing Critical's soft fur, the cheetah looked up from him and at poor Dylan, still a little while away, having a little difficulty trudging over a few tall clusters of grass. "Hey Dylan, get over here, we're taking off soon," she yelled playfully, climbing into the cockpit and leaving the passenger door wide open. "G'day, Cass, I didn't expect to see you out here today. How do you think I felt when I heard that you were the one I'd be flying? It's been so long." Dylan found Cassandra's voice simply calming and adorable to listen to, adoring her thick Norwegian accent. Dylan gave a friendly and reassuring nod to his trusted pilot. Critical climbed in next. Feeling equally as nervous as excited, he sat next to Dylan, nose twitching. With the click of Critical's seatbelt, Cassandra started the engine and the rotors started picking up speed and the noise started to intensify. Critical gripped his seatbelt tightly with his paws, first standing on end in a quivering, shaky sensation as the helicopter lifted off the ground. As it started ascending higher and higher, quick breezes sailed through the open door and rippled all the fur on Critical's left. The side sat right by the wide-open shutter. He sat dead still, mind suspended in the moment, hoping that the doors of the helicopter would slide shut and that he wouldn't have to see and feel the scenery open below him. To his horror, they would not. They simply stayed ajar, revealing the rolling hills of the countryside, just half a mile below. The roar of propellers had become deafening. Struggling to concentrate, Dylan tried adjusting his ears to the noise, tuning in different sounds in and out like radio channels. Eventually, he found just the right angle for his ears to rest at, allowing him to hear sounds from inside the cockpit clearer and dampen the drone of the thundering rotors. Looking down to his satchel to meddle with a little butterfly knife, he noticed that Critical subtly shifted a little closer to him, and a soft and anxious whimper escaped his muzzle. Looking behind his back, he saw Critical's tail curled down in fear. He knew that the little folf wasn't very comfortable, and gently asked what was wrong. Chest concealed by his tightly closed arms, Critical responded softly. "I'm fine. Nothing's wrong, Agent Delta." "Tails don't lie, Private C," Dylan replied, eyebrows raised in curiosity. Critical sighed. "Fine, I'm just scared of heights. That's it." He took a glance outside at the ground below and instantly tensed up and gripped his seatbelt tighter and squeezed his eyes shut. He felt terrified, wishing that he could just be somewhere else right now. Anywhere else but here. Critical started shaking a little at the thought of the miles of air below him. However, out of the panic, he heard a soft sigh from beside him, and he felt a gentle, warm touch reaching around his neck. Critical slowly opened his eyes and saw a little white paw with blunt blue claws on his left shoulder, and felt the touch of a soft triangular paw pad as his instructor pulled him close in protection. Critical eased his clawing grip on the seatbelt, and his tail raised a little. "Agent Delta?" "Does this help, Private C?" Dylan asked in a comforting tone as gentle as silk. Critical gave a slow nod and rested his head on Dylan's soft, fluffy shoulder. Arms still wrapped around the timid furry clinging to him for comfort, Dylan stroked the ruffled cheeks of Critical's face. After a while, he felt Dylan stop. Gaze lowered, Critical watched as Dylan lowered his arm and reached for his paw. He had never been this near Agent Delta before, and Critical noticed a few details that hadn't yet crossed his mind. Under Dylan's drawn back sleeve was a sharp band of black fur, which contrasted from the rest of his otherwise white coat. Critical grasped Dylan's paw tightly, taking note of them, another detail he hadn't seen before. Unlike most paws that Critical had seen in the past, Dylan's were a little different. Rather than a normal mark, in the middle of his paw was a majestic blue triangle paw pad, with 4 smaller pads on his fingers. Other than the sky blue and black, which also appeared in bands on his tail, Dylan didn't seem to have any other colors on his fur. Holding Critical's paw, Dylan gestured out the door. "Let's see if this changes anything," he whispered softly as Critical leaned towards the door. What lay before Critical's eyes was an incredible sight. The grassy plains they had started in had opened up into a vast blue expanse as they flew over the ocean. The sun cast a beautiful glint over the water, and smaller islands could be seen floating by. Critical inhaled sharply, taken by complete surprise at the sudden change of scenery. He waited, readying for his body to realize how high up he was, and feel his fear claw his heart. But he didn't. All he felt was Dylan's safe and warm protection. "Agent Delta, it's beautiful," he gasped out. "I know," Dylan whispered back. Pulling himself away from the window, Critical faced Dylan once again. Still warm in his embrace, Critical's eyes met Dylan in locked gaze of his azure irises. Without another word, Critical pulled Dylan close and held him tight in the same fashion, cuddling soundly and swearing never to let go. Dylan's ears folded back, and he gave Critical a little pat on the back. There. Everyone has their fears, and I know it helps to have someone by you to fight them." Dylan felt Critical raise his eyebrows against his soft cheeks. "Yes, everyone does include me," he continued. "But what would scare you, Agent Delta?" Dylan sighed and clutched his notebook tighter. "The safety of the agency. Have you ever heard of Race before?" Lifting his head a little, Critical nodded in response. Being a recruit, he'd heard many rumors of Raze, a bold antagonist of Claw. "I'm afraid of him. I've seen files. I know what he's done and what he can do." Feeling Dylan's paw inch closer to his, Critical held it gently and wrapped his tail around his instructor. Dylan spoke on with a small tremble in his tone. "I swear to protect you, but in reality, I'm terrified myself." "But I swear to protect you, and I always will, Agent Delta," Critical whispered. Thank you, Private C, and, you can call me Dylan. I don't mind, really." "Any time, Agent Delta." Critical didn't seem to attune himself very well to addressing Dylan by his real name just yet, but Dylan didn't particularly mind. With a new emotion towards Critical that Dylan didn't think he'd ever feel to a recruit, he rested his muzzle on Critical's shoulder as a sign of affection. "Hey, no making out in my helicopter!" a prying voice called from the front of the helicopter. "Agent Etta, we're not making out!" Critical yapped, voice distorted by the strong entering winds. "Oi, Cass! We're having a moment!" Dylan yelled back playfully. The two turned to each other and giggled softly. Having somehow heard the giggle over the rotors, Cass turned around to see Dylan and Critical, paw in paw, with Critical's tail wrapped soundly around Dylan. "Sure you guys aren't," she snickered while swiveling back to face the front. "Anyways, Dylan, speaking of moment, we're approaching the destination." Critical felt Dylan's tail perk up as he was back at attention, excitedly asking how far away. Cassandra didn't answer. Instead, she simply pointed outside the open sliding door. Dylan leant over Critical like a cat eyeing a mouse and saw land right under the open panel. Taking in more of the surroundings, Dylan quickly realized that the island under the copter was rather small and circular in shape, looking as if he could walk around the perimeter in under an hour. The helicopter flew in as low as possible, hovering over the bare sliver of beach that lined a dense overgrown forest which took up the rest of the island. "Alright, this is where you two boys get off," Cass called out from the front over the thundering noise. Seatbelt unbuckled, Critical watched as the flimsy cable unfurled from the helicopter and fell to the ground, swaying at the mercy of the breeze. Feeling his fear return to him, Critical held onto the retracting seatbelt for his dear life, whimpering softly. All of a sudden, his feet were swept off the ground, and Critical yelped and squeezed his eyes shut. He felt the wind against his fur. Perhaps this was it. He tried opening his eyes, ready to see the ground approaching closer and closer for one final time. Instead, however, he opened them and met Dylan's eyes once again. He abruptly realized he was curled up in Dylan's arms, and Dylan had picked him up and was holding on tight. "I thought we should go down together, Private C," he whispered. Completely speechless, Critical nodded and wrapped his arms around Dylan's neck. One hand holding the ladder for descent, and the other keeping Critical safe, Dylan bid his farewell to Cass and climbed down the abrasive rungs. He heard the wind skimming over the trees with a clear rustle and felt it blast the ladder at tree-line height. Though the ladder rocked back and forth violently, Dylan held on, swearing his life that he'd protect the little folf in his arms. Locked in Dylan's arms, Critical watched and waited as the ground drew closer and closer. With a little leap off the bottom rung, Dylan landed on the rough sands of the beach. Laying Critical on the ground, Dylan sniffed the air, almost overwhelmed by the salty redolence of spraying waves. More impressed at the sight rather than the smell, Critical stood up and tilted his muzzle up at the dense vegetation that towered in front of him. What lay ahead seemed like an overgrown mess, yet it had a beauty to it, like a breath of nature. A lush, dense growth in pristine condition, clearly untouched for hundreds of years. "Let's see what training has done for you, Critical," uttered Dylan, handing him the small butterfly knife which normally sat neatly folded in his satchel. "I think you should lead the way," he finished. Tail wagging and paws quivering in excitement, Critical took the knife and trudged into the depths of the tiny jungle, slicing at any small outcrops of vegetation to ensure nobody would be battered in the face or even have their fragile ears clipped by a stray branch. After a short crawl under a low and narrow path, Critical stumbled across a small opening, about the size of a small bathroom, completely devoid of trees. Glancing around, the surrounding trees rose up like a dense wall. In spite of the deep, dark shadows casted by the jungle around him, a small ray of light trickled in from the hole in the forestation above. Pausing to decide where to go next, Critical looked down at the ground and paced back and forth a little with his tail wagging noiselessly. All of a sudden, his thoughts vanished, and he felt his heart drop like lead. Was that? No, it couldn't be. Next to his hind paw, imprinted crystal clear into the ground, was a footprint. Critical tried to convince himself it was old, but with the astonishing clarity of the print of a square-grip shoe, it simply didn't seem to be a possibility. At that instant, Dylan emerged from the dense vegetation and found Critical in the small clearing. Another knife clutched in his hands. He saw Critical crouching down in shock, and immediately ran over and asked him what was wrong. Dylan, too, froze in his tracks as he skidded to a halt and casted a small sprinkle of dirt over the prints in the ground. "Don't make any noise, Private C," Dylan muttered under his breath, barely audible over the rustle of leaves overhead. Struck with both fear and intimidation, Critical gave a feeble nod and stepped back, feeling his weapon folded and clutched tightly in his paws. Critical watched as Dylan brought his muzzle to the floor, nose twitching and sniffing in a desperate search for a scent to lock onto. Giving a little space for his instructor, he searched for something to pass the time and looked around and through the gap in the leaf cover shrouding the sky. Seeing the tips of a cluster of dead branches, Critical took a curious interest to a dead tree which stuck out sharply from the lush green backing. A crisp snap echoed through the air, shattering the relative silence like a thin glass sheet. Something happened. Something fragile had splintered. Critical spun around, fur standing on end, trying to work out where the sound had come from. Ears perked up, he listened for movement, and he heard something. A sound. the dull groan of a slab of wood creaking and complaining against weight. Critical turned his head straight up, and his eyes widened in terror as he saw the lifeless tree from earlier lean in his direction. Tail shaking in frantic desperation, Critical looked at his instructor, still fixated to the print on the ground. "Agent Delta!" "Silence," Dylan replied sternly. "Agent Delta, this is urgent!" The creaking of the tree had amplified into a dull whoosh as the tree started picking up speed as it fell to the ground. Dylan growled back. "Name one thing that is more important than this. Someone could be trying to kill us." Critical quivered in fear, thoughts racing through his head. Taking in a deep sniff, Dylan was truly immersed in the dull and weak scent of the footprint. All of a sudden, with the lack of wind at ground level, Dylan finally got something. With his eyes closed, he tried to track where the scent led, planting his paw down in the direction the smell came from and ready to take the next step and trace it. Too late. A powerful force rammed into Dylan. He yelped and squeezed his eyes shut harder as his left shoulder yielded in pain. Completely knocked off his feet, Dylan felt the shock resonate in his head from the blow. Thoughts violently dissipated. With Agent Delta in his arms, Critical braced for a rough landing as both of them were thrown against the abrasive bark of tree roots. Not an instant later, an ear-splitting crash erupted from behind Critical as the splayed branches crashed into the earth and the brittle wood fragmented violently. With one arm curled around Dylan, Critical used his other to shield Dylan's eyes and cheeks while he buried his face against Dylan's uniform. Mere moments later, he felt a shockwave of dust and a storm of small twigs and splinters ricochet off his shirt. When the dust cleared, Dylan slowly opened his eyes in pain, and realized that Critical was against him and holding him against the surface. Stuttering from anger, he barked at Critical fiercely. "Private C! What is the meaning of this?" Eyes focusing a little more, he was struck with the sudden realization that a massive tree had fallen just where both of them had been situated. A small trickle of blood could be felt on Dylan's forehead. Stammering, the wolf spoke softly to his recruit. Were we just there?" With his eyes gazing into Dylan's, Critical gave a wordless nod. Dylan pawed the ground a little. He wanted to get up and give his recruit a tight hug, but quickly realized that both he and Critical were partially wedged between the thick roots of a tree. Instead, Dylan wrapped his arms around Critical, who could hear his heavy and strained breathing. Though Dylan kept firm silence, the glint in his eyes said a thank you that no words could ever describe. After a moment of contemplation, Dylan wiped the blood off his forehead and pried himself and Critical out from the base of the tree. Critical, with a happy little smile and a brave feeling in his chest, led deeper into the jungle. It had only been a moment before Critical stumbled across another astonishing sight. A beautiful large pond with a small island in the middle. On the island sat a decrepit pavilion, an ornate stone structure almost the size of the tiny island itself. As he heard Dylan trudging behind him, Critical turned away from the pavilion and tried climbing around the mangroves bordering the shallow, still waters. Out of nowhere, a golden glint of light flashed from the corner of his eye. Critical stopped, swiveling his fluffy head to where it came from. He soon realized that it came from the island in the lake, right from the middle of the pavilion. Excitement shone in Critical's eyes, an excitement that kindled his determination as he ran, fur-drenched, through the void black water enclosing the small island. "Agent Delta, I think I found something," he called out, splashing avidly. Dylan, just emerging from the bushes, found Critical once again and ran to the island to catch up with him. Not entirely sure what Critical was on about, he winced as he waded through the knee-deep lake, legs and pants thoroughly soaked by the cold water. Finally catching up to Critical, Dylan dragged himself on the island, taking immediate notice of Critical's staggered gasps. "What is it, Private C?" Dylan queried as he stood up, flicking his sodding tail dry like a mop. He suddenly stopped, taken by the same shock and breathlessness as Critical. Under the ruined roof laid an ornate stone amulet, one corner embedded into a tiny stone pylon. Shocked for words, Dylan crept a little closer, venerating the alluring beauty of the artifact. It was cast in pure silver, with an incomprehensible cryptic language inscribed all over it in pristine gold. There it sat, in all its natural beauty for thousands of years, untarnished by the claws of time. "I think we found it," Private C whispered in Dylan's ears, which were fully erect in anticipation. Suppressing his fears like violent springs, Dylan inched forward and tapped the amulet with his folded and sheathed knife. Nothing happened. In the silence of the falling leaves outside, Dylan grabbed the amulet and shifted it ever so slightly side to side, somehow dislodging it completely from the worn stone. "That was a little easier than I thought," Dylan muttered. A small cracking broke the silence. Tails flew up, fur stood on end, eyes grew wide. Time seemed to stop as Dylan and Critical stared at each other in horror and at the stone in front of Dylan, cracking more and more by the second. The crack started expanding downwards, weaving down the side of the rock and into the cold cobblestone floor. Dylan backed away in fear, and Critical clung to a pillar, watching in fear as the cracks kept protruding, lacing the floor in a chaotic labyrinthine fracture. To both their reliefs, the cracking eventually slowed to a halt, reaching like talons at the quivering paws of the two explorers. "It's all hollow. Private C, we need to get out of here, now," Dylan commanded fiercely. His yell echoed throughout the jungle, a resonance punctuated by sprinting footfalls that neither Critical nor Dylan had heard just yet. Hanging by the thinner shreds of his composure, Dylan heard a splash filled with motion and content. Another violent splash erupted from behind him, and then both spun around, and not a moment too soon. With a flurry of red and white, a blur of metal penetrated the air and struck the hard stone next to Critical with a resounding clang, barely missing his soft muzzle and lopping off the tips of half his whiskers. Frozen in shock, Critical was so close to the blade that he could smell the metal, cruel and desirous of blood. The assailant wrenched his hatchet from the stone with a sickening scrape and crept into the pavilion, still oblivious that Dylan was there too. There was no going back now. Dylan lashed out and kicked the armed furry in the chest, knocking him off his paws and onto the ground of the island. He stood tall and faced his adversary, knowing that trying to flee would put him and poor Critical at great risk. What lay before him, however, made his jaw drop to the ground and the air feel cold around him. A majestically crimson-red coated folf stood blocking the path to the escape, his deep blue tufts of hair swaying in the wind, in a way alike the flowing white tip of his tail. He grimaced, a flare of intense animosity burning in his eyes. Stammering for words, Dylan saw the scar that cut across the folf's left eye, and he already knew it all. "Raise," Dylan muttered, seething with rage. "Oh, it's been a while, hasn't it?" Raise snickered sinisterly, a grin snaking across his face shadowed by his dark hood. "What do you want now?" Dylan snarled fiercely. His grin broke into a wicked smile as he twirled his hatchet in his paws. "You!" With a cry of passion, the folf charged forward with a massive horizontal swing at Dylan. Dylan, holding his knife in his quivering paws, was quick on his feet. He backstepped the attack and disarmed Ray's vulnerable arm, both watching as the hatchet fell to the side. Hearing Ray swear under his breath, Critical, still against the wall in terror, watched as Agent Delta rolled to the side and grabbed the small axe. He stood back up, ready to attack. Ears up in determination, Dylan swung the blunt edge of the hatchet aimed at Ray's head, but was suddenly stopped by a powerful force. A massive metallic clang rang out, and sparks flew as Dylan's axe was met by another. Racing from the recoil, Ray's locked gazes with Dylan, who had been knocked to the floor, holding a secondary hatchet he had drawn from his slim backpack. Readying for a final swing, he stared right at Dylan, who was still recovering and cornered against a fractured rock in the middle of the room. He raised the hatchet with a mocking sneer. "Any last words?" Quivering in a desperate attempt to helplessly raise the weapon above his head, Dylan uttered a soft whimper in reply. "Looks like it's the end of the line, then," Agent Delta. Squeezing his eyes shut, Dylan heard the whooshing of the axe slicing down. This was it. "You don't deserve to call him that!" A sudden cry yelped out, as Critical leapt from the wall and threw himself at Reyes. He had thrown Reyes off balance, but Reyes was fully committed and there was no stopping it. Reyes drove the axe down, missing Dylan by merely an inch and instead plunging it into the weak stone. Time seemed to stand still as the three exchanged looks in horror, frozen like icicles in anticipation of the danger that was about to unfold. Not a moment later, a deafening roar erupted from the ground as the earth buckled and shattered. Still held in shock, they watched as a massive crack opened right behind Dylan, and the rock fractured in two, and everything on the other side of the pavilion fell with the crumbling earth into a dark abyss of a chasm. While Reyes remained astonished at the water of the lake cascading into the void, Dylan wasn't going to waste the opportunity. With a swift kick of his foot, Dylan wrenched Reyes' second axe out of his grip and off the edge of the cliff. The ground still shook with the incessant tremor. Reyes, unarmed, tried wrestling Dylan onto the ground, praying that by chance he could throw him off the edge of the cliff. Teeth gritted, Dylan fought back hard, wincing at Reyes' sharp claws digging into his shoulder. It wasn't long before Critical, too, joined the fight and wrenched Reyes off Dylan, throwing him aside. Despite the loud roar of the collapsing island, both Critical and Dylan heard the tired and desperate pants of the hostile folf. He couldn't keep this up for much longer. With one final cry, Reyes charged forward and lashed out, not at Dylan, but at poor Critical instead. Dylan tried to stop him with the axe, but it was too late. Reyes tackled Dylan's recruit with such a force that he flew and slid right to the edge of the cliff, tail sailing through the air. Dylan turned a blind eye to the situation, hoping that Critical would be fine. He was determined. With one final blow, he knocked Reyes off his feet and stood, threatening him with the axe clutched in his paws. Reyes tried backing up, his torn robe and scratched red fur dragging along the barely intact stone floor. Suddenly, he drew out yet another hatchet from his bag and raised it. That is, before Dylan sliced it clean in half like a stick of butter. "Enough axes, Reyes," he snarled. Reyes tried backing up further away, but he was stopped by the trunk of a tree. Dylan had him cornered. Though Critical landed near the edge of the cliff, he wasn't out of danger from the momentum. Grinding his paws into the stone in a fruitless attempt to break, Critical could only watch as his legs slid and skidded right over the edge. His heart dropped in his chest. Clawing frantically, Critical tried grasping anything he could hold on to as his lower body dragged him further over the ledge, and the outcrop bit into his chest like a fang. As hard as Critical fought with his paws, it was no use. He looked down at the void below him, welling up with tears and shaken to pieces with fear as his paws slipped past another groove in the stone. Critical's head fell below the ridge, and only his paws were left holding onto the ledge for his dear life. Struggling against all odds, he could feel the strength drained from his scratched arms as if it was bleeding out. Dylan clutched his exposed and blood-stained shoulder, holding the axe horizontally to pin Reyes against the tree. "What are you gonna do with me? Kill me?" Reyes snarled. "Oh, we don't do that here at Claw," Dylan growled in response. "I'm taking you away, where you won't cause trouble ever again," he continued, trembling in a synthesis of anger, obstinacy, and perhaps even fear. Raising the axe with the blunt end again, Dylan was ready to knock Reyes out for a final time and arrest him. Dylan gritted his teeth, hearing a defeated whimper from his adversary as Reyes tried to curl up as much as he could. All of a sudden, Dylan's eyes widened, and he loosened his tight grip on the hatchet. A helpless cry called out from behind him. "Dylan! Help me! Please!" Critical yelped out, with all the strength left in his helplessly dangling body. Dylan's mind raced. His ears knew everything. They saw Critical, straining and holding onto the cliff, his faltering paws keeping him alive by a thread. But with Dylan's eyes, he saw his absolute adversary, helpless in front of him. He could end it all, but it was torn in two. In the split second of standing frozen still, decisions clawed and tugged at his volitions. Dylan couldn't take it anymore. He swung the flat edge blindly at Razor's side and dived. Squeezing his eyes shut, Critical could hold on no more. Out of his faint and trembling voice, he mumbled his last remarks. "Go on without me. I gave my allegiance, my life, for this mission. For the Force. May you stay safe, Dylan." With one last tear running down Critical's soft cheeks, he let his arms, singed with pain, rest. His paws fell. For one brief moment, Critical stood in the air, about to fall to a dark fate. "Watch your mouth, Private C!" Before Critical even felt the wind against him, a sudden tight and warm grip grabbed Critical by the wrist as Dylan threw himself across the floor to save his recruit. Critical's eyes flew wide open and looked up as they met with Dylan's gazing right back with a reassuring safety. "I will never let that happen," Dylan grunted through his trembling voice. Laying on his chest now, Dylan grabbed Critical's other paw tightly and held him steady, gently pulling him back up to the cliff where both of them laid on the roughed floor, sore and cut in every place imaginable. By the time both were able to sit upright, Dylan glanced feebly at the tree where Race was cornered, seeing nothing but an abandoned axe. Before he could even utter a word, Critical threw himself over Dylan, muzzle hung over his fluffy shoulder and sobbing quietly. "Agent Delta, I'm so sorry. You would have caught him if I wasn't there," Critical stuttered between sniffles. How am I going to become an agent now?" Feeling the warm, exposed chest of the little folf, Dylan held Critical close and hugged him tight. "You would make an amazing agent, Private C. I just changed my mind," Dylan whispered gently as he felt Critical lean more hopelessly on him and heard a soft tear fall to the stone. "I didn't think it would do you justice, Critical," he continued softly. Critical's eyes opened wide, and Dylan felt his ears rise from their submissive folded concealments. "Dylan, you didn't call me Private C. What does that mean?" "I don't want you to become just an agent. I want you to become my partner," he spoke with a tone as clear as glass. Critical froze, jaw dropped in total awe and shock. "What do you say, Critical? Do you accept?" Dylan whispered as he smiled and saw Critical's tail wag enthusiastically. Critical cheered out and hugged Dylan around the neck as tightly as he could. "I do!" "Good," Dylan breathed as he held his former recruit just as tightly. After a short moment, Critical sat back to make eye contact with Dylan and spoke softly. "What about Ray's now? Is he going to keep trying to stop us? What about you, Dylan? Doesn't he terrify you?" "Critical, I let him go to save you," Dylan replied, placing his stained paws on Critical's shoulders in a gentle reassurance. "Why? Because, Critical, as long as you are by my side, I will never, ever be afraid of him again." Dylan gazed deep into Critical's eyes and saw a shine of immeasurable joy and comfort. He smiled a warm smile back at his partner, happy tears welling up in the corners of his eyes. In the midst of the persistent rustling leaves in the wind, the pair heard their familiar helicopter in the distance, rotors roaring through the air. Dylan gave a cheerful grin at Critical through the scars and claw marks on his face. "Let's go home, partner." Critical smiled back, his eyes, too, filled with tears of joy. "Yes, partner."